All right. Well, we have, so this panel is a next generation panel. I don't know if you can tell that from the participants. A very next generation setup here. But maybe first of all, if I get everyone to just introduce themselves and kind of explain who they are and what their company does, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm the CEO of Deis. Beau Vrolyk is my name. And Deis is a set of modules which allow you to run applications on Kubernetes.
I'm Ben Sigelman. I'm founder at LightStep. We're a company that's basically commercializing a bunch of distributed tracing technology that I developed at Google for microservice architectures in the large. So.
My name's Andy, CTO at Wercker. Our company does a sort of container-centric automation platform for multi-service, cloud-native applications.
Awesome. So we're going to have a couple of questions to kind of kick us off, but we'd love to get everyone participating. I think there's a microphone floating around, but if you have questions or you have something you'd like to ask, then just raise your hand and we'll keep an eye out for you and we'll get you involved in the conversation as well. So just to kind of kick us off, where do you think we are in terms of the adoption of microservices and containers? It's been a pretty exciting few years with lots of new technologies, lots of new companies coming out. What does that actually translate to in terms of customer adoption?
Okay, so first of all, microservices have been around a long time. This didn't just happen 18 months ago. I think that the migration to use them is probably in its first third, and I think it'll take us a decade to get to the point where they're broadly adopted.
Well, I agree entirely that they've been around for a while by other names. It's great marketing to come up with microservices. I can't wait for nanoservices. They're going to blow our minds. But
Pico. We're going to Pico.
Okay, we're going to Pico. What I've noticed is that if you wander around San Francisco and just like walk into your favorite tech company, they're probably talking about this. But when you move to kind of old school enterprises that aren't technology driven but depend on technology for their businesses, I think that they perceive a lot of early adoption risk, which is, I think, quite legitimate. The tooling around microservices is still in its infancy, and I think that they feel that pain. And I have some funny war stories from talking with people who've done a migration of microservices without really knowing what they're getting into. So I think we're still kind of in early days as far as tooling is concerned, but the vision has finally become proliferated, and I think that's an incredibly important thing. And companies that have deployed it at scale have shown that this is a superior architecture for applications that are sufficiently complex to warrant it. So.
How about you, Andy? Do you see a lot of customers adopting this now, or is this still something that's a push?
So we definitely, I mean, as a tool specifically for building things like microservice-oriented sort of apps, we definitely see a lot of it. Again, though, I would agree it is definitely sort of, yes, your favorite SF startups and the sort of hip startups in other parts of the world. But it is rising, I think, very quickly in the enterprise space. Specifically, everybody realizes everybody is now a technology company. Everybody has to build superior software to outplay their competitors in every field at this point. So those people are looking very actively at what makes their developers develop faster. Microservices was one of the ways it does that. Unfortunately, yes, there's still many operational issues that make it more difficult for them to adopt.
Ben, and you mentioned kind of tooling. I mean, what specifically? I mean, what are the parts of, because there are tons of great tooling companies out there providing support or providing the kinds of products that help people get up and running with microservices and with containers. Like, what are the elements of the tooling you think are missing or that don't work well at the moment?
Well, I think the biggest piece for me when I think about it, it's not that, I mean, many of the startups working in the space are fantastic. To a certain extent, it maybe is some marketing and trust cycle that needs to develop where customers have success with these small organizations that are providing these tools, and then that success is documented and then larger customers buy in. But the places where I think it's more fundamental have to do with standardization, where there are aspects of this tooling that require standards between the interoperating microservices. And since so much of microservice architecture right now is essentially still at the VM level, I mean, containers are not. It's like the concepts that are being exposed are VM level concepts. My sense, anyway, is that application level tooling and standardization is one of the main barriers to success for these various organizations trying to provide standard monitoring or standard orchestration tools, is that we need to make sure that your entire service, your entire architecture rather, is using consistent, not just nouns and verbs, but actual APIs in order to assemble everything. Because if you have 80% knowledge of your microservice architecture, that tool probably isn't going to work very well. So standardization is necessary to get to 100% that the tools have to hit.
Do you see that as well, Beau? Is that something?
Well, I think there's a meta-level problem. For at least 30 years, we had a tremendous problem developing applications because they were large, hairball, complicated things. So we discovered that we could take them apart and decompose them into microservices. What that did was it's playing whack-a-mole. We squished the problem that the application developer has, and that just moved the problem over and became the operator's problem. Because now the operator, who is completely ill-equipped to deal with running 30,000 microservices in one data center, it suddenly is scrambling around the countryside looking for tools that allow them to manage, deploy, roll forward, roll back, debug, the whole process. So what's happened is we've made the application developer's life a lot better. It's like, whoopee, we can do this. The developer is going, good grief, what happened to my data center? And that's the problem we're in the middle of solving right now. And that's the one that's going to take a decade to solve.
What inside that? I mean, like, what are the kind of you mentioned deployment, you mentioned monitoring. I mean, what are the big things you think need to get knocked down to make this kind of easier for people to migrate?
Well, first of all, right now, I don't believe people are actually migrating current working applications into microservices, because if they're current working applications, the last thing a data center wants to do is touch them. So the only thing we've got going on right now, as far as we can see, are new applications which are trying to address new markets. Those are written from scratch for microservices, so people tend to co-evolve their skill in the operations side as well as the authoring of the application. And those are relatively easy in a stateless world. When we get to stateful applications, we all watch the wheels fall off the bus as people try and get containers deployed with really large data sets. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done there.
Well, Andy, you're actually, I mean, with Wercker, you're helping a lot of people think about that deployment pipeline and how you actually roll out new microservices or keep them up to date. I mean, how are your customers reacting to the deployment challenges of microservices?
It's been interesting. So we've been seeing a lot of uptake on, say, Kubernetes. That's been a very popular deployment platform because it has some of the verbs and nouns that we want to see, some of the stuff that Beau was just describing. So our tool, we deploy to Kubernetes ourselves. One of the issues that we've run into and we see other people run into is it's very comfortable to do a kubectl command line call to deploy something to Kubernetes. However, that sort of requires you to test in prod or staging to find out whether something is working. Where we have been trying to design our product and our own application itself such that those interactions can be tested before things go up by having multiple containers as part of your development environment. So I think that's sort of the next stage in doing these things reliably and reproducibly is having it test before you actually deploy, rather than just pushing it to staging and hoping that everything works and asking whether anybody else is using it right now. That doesn't scale up very far past like a 20-person company.
Fair enough. And Beau, you said kind of 10 years, you think. We've got 10 years of the current kind of container technologies, microservices approach before we've kind of done with that phase of technology, do you think?
Well, if we just look backwards and look at how long it took relational databases to actually get deployed, it was a decade.
Yeah.
And I don't see any reason to believe that the complexity here is any less than that. In fact, I think it's quite a bit worse. So I believe that we will continue to evolve these toolkits and we will build out the infrastructure. We eventually are going to wind up with what I would refer to as a fly-by-wire system, where people want to have their monitoring and alerting systems automatically reach into the cluster and change the parameters of the cluster based on what's really going on. We're just at the beginning of all that, but that's where we're headed.
I'd optimistically disagree a little bit in that I do think it'll be a bit faster. I think we have a lot more eyes on the problem now, and we have a lot more sort of communal experience via very good shared forums, open source technology, things like this. I think the rate of advance is going quite a bit faster than
do you see any kind of,
for example,
do you see
databases.
Any, fragmentation though, because there's a lot of capital, sort of venture capital, a lot of corporates deploying large amounts of money into certain technologies, certain specifications, some of which don't work together too well. I mean, we've seen some good progress. We've seen the Open Container Forum, we've seen AppC, Rocket and Docker playing nice together. Do you think that we'll see further consolidation of those specifications, or do you think the capital is going to push people to forge their own path and try and take more of the market to themselves?
Myself, I think I've worked on a lot of standards. There's always more than one. So I don't think that we're going to find a magical solution that is a standard. I do think the actively making your tooling be sort of as agnostic as possible to the underlying things, and being able to give some transparency into underlying stuff as well is probably your best bet going forward in almost all cases. The developers will figure out how to solve problems if they can see where the problems are. But as long as those are hidden from them and abstracted away by sort of genericized standards, generic APIs, and things like this. For example, in Kubernetes, I'd much rather have access to specific Docker commands and specific Rocket commands than simply a generic API. Because there are things I would like to do that require that. And so right now I have to, for example, mount Docker sockets into some of my containers in order to do specific Docker control operations. So I really don't think those are going to go away. That said, I do think the argument towards the standards is a informative one.
Yeah.
I mean, I see this a little bit slightly differently than I think both of you. As far as the time to adoption, that implies that the goal for microservices is for all applications to be built on microservices. I would posit that the timeline for that is infinity. I mean, there are definitely situations where a database, like an honest-to-God, old-school relational database, and a front end are exactly all that you need, and you probably shouldn't build a microservice architecture for that. It doesn't make any sense, So we should be restricting ourselves to things where microservices are appropriate. Within that frame, I would tend to be a little bit more of an optimist, I guess, just because I think the benefits are so substantial for systems that are appropriate for microservices that economics alone would push people in the direction of doing this, just given how expensive developers are right now. But I also would say, as far as standardization is concerned, if you look at networking protocols, which I think are somewhat of an analogy for what we're dealing with right now, I mean, you have things like HTTP or things that are even above HTTP at like an application layer, and you've seen like nice standards develop at every layer of the OSI stack. And as far as microservices are concerned, especially in terms of scheduling and deployment, most of the standardization, if things like Docker and Rocket are considered standards, I would say are kind of like the analogs of TCP. It's sort of like a level 3 of the OSI stack that we're standardizing on for orchestration. And that doesn't really make sense to me. Like, we need primitives like HTTP. I don't mean literally HTTP, but we need primitives at that level of the stack in order to make sense of these things. Like right now, you deploy a bunch of containers, and really, like a priori, if you don't know exactly which tools you're using, you kind of know nothing about what's happening there. Maybe you know what ports are exposed, and that's it. And it's just not sufficient. Like, we need that kind of OSI 6 and like a sort of L7, and like the Nginx talks that was just preceding this one. Like, there's no like Nginx sort of application level routing analog for that's as standardized as what you see in the networking space for microservices. And I see that kind of standardization as being fairly essential. I agree that there will be probably 3 standards or something, but that's better than 0. Like right now, that's kind of how I feel like the current state of the world is.
So yeah, if anyone has any questions, by the way, we have a microphone here. So
we also have a bunch of seats in the front.
Yeah, so you can come on and sit down.
If I could
yeah, sure.
go on, I think what we're disagreeing about is because we're talking about 2 different things. I think that the technology will be sorted out within a couple of years.
Yeah.
The social fabric of the developers and the operations people who are actually making the decisions, and it gets worse and worse the further up the organization you go in an enterprise 100 company, that person's frame of reference from a technology point of view is typically 15 to 20 years out of date, because that's when they were last a technologist. They've been a political operative within a large corporation for the last 15 years. So the decision making for the Fortune 100 is, we're finding, very odd. Right. They're perfectly willing to risk experiments on service-oriented architectures for things that they don't think are mission critical. Those are typically web-facing, consumer-facing. Oddly enough, they consider their customers not mission critical. Sure, yeah. But it's consumer-facing. It's things that aren't going to break the business if it doesn't work. And they'll run an experiment which they think should take a year or 2. And after that, then they'll decide whether they want to go through the cultural transformation of teaching all their people how to do things in this new way. And so I completely agree that the technology is coming at us much faster than that. But I think the social fabric of developers outside of the tools business is going to adopt very slowly. And that's going to be the pacing item for this market.
So
Maybe
it's not,
we need to promote a couple of new grads to be CIOs
Yeah.
of Fortune 100 companies.
Amen, please, please. Yes.
so it's not the technology, it's the politics and the organizational ineffectiveness
It's the
getting in the
ability
way.
for human beings to abandon what they know has worked for them for many, many years and take on something new. They're not, the more money they have and the bigger the company is, the more careful they're going to be about that change.
So I have some anecdotal, I guess, sort of stories from that. Prior to this, I worked on a project called OpenStack, and so I started writing that for NASA a long, long time ago. Then at some point, we found out the NSA had been using it, and so they've been using it. They use it quite heavily. They're probably one of the larger deploys of it, and that simply started because some developers at NSA wanted to run some servers. They didn't want to go through the requisition process, so they wanted to have requisition a few servers and run their own little cloud. Other developers found out, started using it, and now eventually the entire intelligence community in the U.S. government, which is a very political, very slow entity, now uses this new technology very heavily because it was driven from developers up. And again, I think that is the NSA and the intelligence community is probably a little bit different than, for example, say, I don't know, NASA. But NASA was also doing this, and now there's a lot of competing markets there. There's people who want supercomputer time. There's people who want cloud time and whatnot. A lot of people just want to run a WordPress blog, but I do think the sort of groundswell is capable of doing a lot of stuff. A lot of the people we work with in the larger enterprises are sort of the experiments, like you said. They're the skunkworks and the people who have a smaller team within a large organization who are able to play with the cool new stuff rather than having to live in their existing world. But I do think it's quite easy for developers to switch what they want to do. And I agree, there's still COBOL applications like running all banks in the world. But I think it's a sizable market share.
Are there kind of further technological abstractions that you think are going to be made, or will maybe change the political landscape, or change how organizations think about this? I mean, there's once you look past containers, people are talking about event-driven computing and Lambda. People are talking about unikernels even. I mean, are there other kind of technological shifts that you think might make it even easier for people to move to a different, to move to maybe not the container-style architecture, microservices architecture, but the next generation of architecture? I
think that sort of goes a little bit to what he was talking about a second ago, which is that we're talking about the standardization on the sort of higher level. And I'd also kind of argue that I think we're to some degree there. There's a lot of things using containers that people don't know or have to know. So if you're talking about, for example, an app that uses a traditional relational database, you can just go to talk to the Herokus and App Engines of the world, and that will probably get you there. There's a billion hosting things that have solved that problem for simple application like topologies. I think the people who are at this event are people who are working towards building something not quite as traditional. And I think for those traditional things, your problem's mostly solved. And so again, the reason why we did the OpenStack stuff for NASA was not because they wanted a cloud, it's because they wanted to run WordPress blogs, right? So we were supposed to write a PaaS. We ended up having to start by writing a infrastructure as a service. But realistically, they wanted a PaaS. And there's people who provide those, and there's various types. And as we're moving up the layers, you have different sort of encapsulation methodologies of your application. And so containers is great, and so on Kubernetes and things like this, I can run an application quite easily using that platform. But yeah, I would say that largely the people who are doing a more traditional style of thing already have a solved problem, as long as they're willing to have somebody else host it. So then what's that next encapsulation? What's that next abstraction, do you think, that comes after people get very settled with containers and microservices?
Personally, so for the record, was totally brainwashed at Google. I started there right when I graduated from college, and I was there for 9 years, so I have no idea if this is true, but in my completely brainwashed mentality, I really love the abstraction of actually, since so many people here probably use Go or something, basically something analogous to an RPC interface to a Go interface. That is using the word interface twice in different ways. But the idea of just a set of related methods that compose an API, I think that's a great thing to build like a single microservice component around. And I really wish that that was what we were scheduling rather than containers that represent VMs. I think that's a natural thing. Lambda is kind of the embarrassingly parallel case of that, right? Where it's like, it's just one function and that's it. And it has no state. And you can just repeat it ad infinitum. Like it's perfect for things where that's perfect. I think Lambda is interesting, but it's also really simplistic. And any reasonable application with some complexity will probably want to have some process local caches and so on and so forth, which are really inappropriate for that architecture just from a first principle standpoint. But I like the idea of a set of composed methods being an abstraction, and I'm looking forward. I think my mic just died. Oh, there it goes. I'm looking forward to a future version of microservice technologies that really understands that semantically and builds it into all of the tooling, whether it be from a blue-green rollout standpoint like you were talking about earlier, or a monitoring and tracing standpoint, or scheduling or whatever. So.
I think there's another problem we have just begun to solve. If you go into big data applications, you find data scientists, and there's a human being who knows how the business works, and that person talks to a data scientist who then tries to translate that into something that Hadoop or Spark or whatever can actually understand. What we're doing there is we're looking at somebody taking business logic and trying to get it turned into code. We have the same problem here with all these applications. We have it with all however the API is structured. We're trying to take something that's extraordinarily fuzzy in the mind of the developer, have someone who's a business person who understands exactly how their business works, or at least they believe they do. It may not. But that translation, there is no language for that we've developed yet. We're so far away from being able to do that it's embarrassing. The people who crack that problem will win in a gigantic way.
Is that something you think that people should be working on? Is making it easier for maybe not the lay person, but the kind of the non-technical user to use some more of these more powerful features that we're building into?
So look, the times when we have had gigantic revolutions in this business is when we have enfranchised an entirely new group of programmers. It's not building better tools for programmers that's caused giant revolutions. It's when we get people who aren't programmers to do something where they don't think of it as programming.
Yeah.
When we look at putting formulae in a spreadsheet, what we did was we turned every accountant in the world into a programmer. And it was a weird-ass programming language, to tell you the truth, but it worked. And the same thing is true with a word processor. You're creating a tool which allows a constituent population that doesn't think they're programming to suddenly be able to program. We're missing that when it comes to large, complicated work process. We don't have a good tool that models work process in a definitive way and allows us in the technology space to then write a compiler for work process. That's the rest. And I'll tell you, the first time you enfranchise a new group of programmers who don't think they're programming, you're going to see a market explode, which is exactly what we've seen with spreadsheets, with word processors, with WordPress, all the rest. These people don't want to be programmers.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, do you have any questions out there for our panel? No, otherwise we'll just keep talking ourselves. All right, no? All right, well, I'm going to be very specific. AWS Lambda has had a decent amount of traction so far. It's a vendor-specific solution. Do you think there needs to be the equivalent package standard for the Docker, Racket, open container world as well, for building event-driven applications on top of containers?
I think there definitely could be. So we talked about things like gRPC and things like this. There's sort of various ways to have easily identifiable, easily reflective APIs for different stuff. There's various weird, interesting projects out on the internet for, you see it most in something like the NPM community, which I'm not super fond of the actual package manager, but the fact that people write literally like 2-line packages means you can, if you talk about say your Go app, there's already things that are doing linking between stuff. It's calling something at some other part of an application. Because it's a single app, it's probably sharing some memory of some sort somewhere you're not really supposed to. But assuming you didn't, there's not a whole lot of reason why you couldn't compile just one function from one application, like expose as an interface, and have a script that automatically knows how to compile that, expose that via HTTP inside of a Docker container, and give it a random port. That's pretty much all Google does as well. You know, like you have reflective APIs. It finds a random port, and there's a way to discover which port that API is on to do your job. That can be done, and there's weird, interesting little projects. There's basically the NICs of like functions for people trying to mess around with that idea.
Ben, obviously you can't talk too much about what Google was building inside, but I mean, do you, what are the things that you think are interesting in that space?
Well, I mean, I think that we have an opportunity for more standardization around Docker and Rocket, et cetera. I think that layer, I mean, they're kind of becoming de facto standards of their own, for better or worse, but like that could work. It's not like you have to pay a licensing fee to use it or something, so that works for me. I'm much more concerned about standardization up the stack from that. That's where I think all the problems are. And if you want to build this is not what you said, but to build Visual Basic for Docker or whatever you want to call it, it's like that sort of thing. Really what we're missing are primitives that are far up the stack from the containers themselves. I think that's why. I'll just say a quick anecdote. Like, I've been talking to a lot of companies that are actually kind of like the forefront of technology thinking, kind of hipster engineering companies based in San Francisco with a couple hundred engineers. And without exception, all of them at this point are in a position where they feel like everyone else has deployed this microservice stuff and it's going well, but they feel like they're deploying it and they're like totally blind in production. But they're ironically all in that situation. I think that the lack of standardization in terms of the way the applications are threaded together. I'll just shout. The lack of standardization, I think, is really, really, really a pressing problem from a visibility standpoint. People literally do not know what's happening to their transactions across their systems. And to me, distributed tracing, like the Open Tracing project, anything having to do with like standardized orchestration at the application method layer, that's where I think the standards need to happen. I think Docker and Rocket we're way ahead of standards on that front than we are higher up the stack.
And Beau, that's some of the stuff that you were kind of focused on as well?
Well, Lambda is what should you call it? It's one example. It's one narrow, very narrow possible thing you could do with these technologies. I would suggest there's a consumer version, IFTTT, which is just the world's most primitive version of Lambda, right? And so we're just beginning to explore this space. And frankly, I think building something out of IFTTT would probably get more real work done than Lambda will.
Good stuff. All right. Well, listen, I think we're coming up to our half-hour slot. We've got a big stop sign behind there. Look at that. Perfect. All right. Well, just please help me with giving a warm round of applause. Thank our panel.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.